Over the years, the worldwide military-industrial complex, fossil fuel companies, and its greedy, wicked minions like the politicians and the media, both TV and print, have nearly perfected the art of subjugating a country for selling weapons of war and for scavenging its natural resources. For the sake of ease, let's call these ferocious scavengers the 0.01% that are based in the US. The methodology is so standard now that it is almost a trope. All the developing or vulnerable nations are at all times being primed for slaughter. All. It starts with floating some dangerous sounding words around the victim countries that set the Western world's narrative. After all, taxpayers in the US and UK will fund the war. They will send their children to fight in the countries they have not even heard of. Their children will lose their life and limb and will get absolutely no share in the spoils of the war or proper health care. Therefore, the taxpayers' buy-in into this heist is absolutely critical. The step-by-step methodology to scavenge a country is now so well-tuned that it can be recognized as a playlist. These are the hit tracks of the subjugation playbook. Track number 1, dictatorial fascist leader. Track number 2, the country poses an imminent threat to humanity. Track number 3, there is an oppression of minorities. Track number 4, human rights are being violated. And if all else fails, a bonus track, track 5, the children are being killed. Today, I will share Iraq's example where this playlist was effectively used to decimate a country and scavenge its natural resources. So, do you remember why Iraq war started? I'll remind you. The World Trade Towers in New York City, US were brutally attacked by Osama bin Laden, who seemed to have been backed by Saudi Arabia. To avenge the loss of innocent lives, the US attacked Iraq. But why not Saudi Arabia? Because Saudi Arabia has made the US wealthy thanks to the petrodollars concept, and because Saudi Arabia has ex-US presidents or their family members always on many lucrative board of directors seats in their companies. And why attack Iraq? The US was friends with Iraq till Iraq, which was then being ruled by Saddam Hussein, did all the bidding of the US. I want to clarify that when I mention the US, I do not mean the country and her beautiful people. I mean only the 0.01 top crème de la crème of the country. Anyway, such was the loving friendship that the US sold Iraq lethal chemical weapons to be used against the Kurds. This deep friendship, though, soured very quickly when Iraq chose to sell its petrol in the international market with gold rather than the US dollars. That's when the US government decided that enough was enough. Now, they simply had to bring democracy in Iraq. Plus, Iraq had so much yummy oil that the 0.01% loves ever so much. So, in 2003, the subjugation playlist was brought out. Track number 1, remember? Establish a dictatorial fascist leader who, in this case, was very conveniently Saddam Hussein, a dictator. Track 2, identify an imminent threat to humanity that, in this case, were the WMDs. Weapons of mass destruction, biological weapons, chemical weapons, radiological weapons. It was a bit of an imaginative overreach because such WMDs have not been found in Iraq till date. No matter, the whole ecosystem of US politicians and their loyal media harped on these mythical WMDs so persistently that eventually the US taxpayers got a bit concerned.
Very seriously. I take the fact that he develops weapons of mass destruction very seriously.
Saddam Hussein's intentions have never changed. He is not developing the missiles for self-defense. These are missiles that Iraq wants in order to project power, to threaten, and to deliver chemical, biological, and, if we let him, nuclear warheads.
The authorization for the use of military force against Iraq resolution was a joint resolution passed by the US Congress in October of 2002 to authorize the US states armed forces use against Saddam Hussein's Iraq government in what would be known as Operation Iraqi Freedom. The US taxpayers forego their infrastructure, healthcare benefits, education funds, and their children to fight this Iraqi freedom war. Track 3. Oppression of minorities. The Halja poison gas attack occurred in 1988 during the Iran-Iraq war. The Iraqi forces used chemical weapons and thousands of Kurdish minority were killed. Some 1 million Kurds were allowed to resettle in model villages. According to a US Senate staff report, these villages were, quote, poorly constructed, had minimal sanitation and water, and provided few employment opportunities for the residents, end quote. Can you imagine the US 0.1% being concerned about oppression of minorities? A quick reminder that US had sold Iraq chemical weapons that were used against the Kurds. Also, it was the US that took away its cover from the Kurds at the Syria-Turkey border that led to a Kurds bloodbath in 2019. Because of the US, Iraq was decimated and thousands of Iraqis were forced to leave home and become migrants. Was it not the US who kept illegal immigrant children in cages? But hey, we have learned that it's perfectly okay for the US and its ally, the UK, to attack a country in retaliation of cruel acts, but the same acts, when done by them, are totally acceptable. Track 4. Violation of human rights. The US harped on the fact that there were no democracy in Iraq. Iraqi citizens were not legally allowed to assemble. Police checkpoints on Iraq's roads and highways prevented ordinary citizens from traveling across the country without government permission and expensive exit visas. Sounds to me like Saudi Arabia, best friend of the US. But Saudi does not bother the 0.01%. Also, the activities of Iraqi citizens who received money from relatives abroad were closely monitored. So here, their greedy duplicity is again on display. Edward Snowden, a CIA whistleblower, had proved that the US government undertakes the sneakiest and the most thorough surveillance of its citizens. Edward Snowden is in exile. And why is the US braying for Julian Assange's blood? Because Julian Assange of WikiLeaks exposed their dreadful human rights violation records in the Middle East. What is the US doing in Guantanamo Bay? A dreaded torture facility that is in violation of every possible human right. The list can go on and on. And finally, when all else fails, dial it up a notch with track number 5. The children are being killed. In October 1990, a 15-year-old girl who identified herself as Naira gave a spine-chilling testimony before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus that after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, she had witnessed Iraqi soldiers take newborn babies out of incubators in a Kuwaiti hospital and leave the babies to die on the cold floor.
I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer. The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying. I could not help but think of my nephew.
Obviously, then the US, with the assistance of its ever so loyal sidekick UK, had to attack Iraq. To convince UK's ordinary people to let go of their taxpayers' money for attacking a tiny country far, far away, her story was corroborated by Amnesty International, a British NGO which published several independent reports about the killings and testimony from evacuees. The two protectors of the galaxy, George Bush and Tony Blair, bombed Iraq to their heart's content. It was later revealed that Naira's last name was Al-Sabah and that she was the daughter of Saud Al-Sabah, the Kuwaiti ambassador to United States. It was further revealed that her testimony was organized as a public relations campaign, which was run by the American public relations firm Hill+Knowlton for the Kuwaiti government. Al-Sabah's statement is regarded as a classic example of modern atrocity propaganda. Later, with egg on its face, Amnesty International reacted by issuing a correction where its executive director, John Healey, accused the Bush administration of, quote, opportunistic manipulation of the international human rights movement, unquote. Amnesty International, Washington Post, New York Times, Fox News, The Guardian, CNN, etc. have come together for this deadly propaganda. Iraq's current reality is rampant ISIS violence, continuous bombing by the US backed by the UK, a Shia-Sunni civil war, and constant thieving of Iraq's natural fossil fuel resources. After 17 years of bringing democracy to Iraq, this is what it is today. After lakhs of casualties, the country is depleted. Forget about democracy. There is no hope for freedom, not a glimmer of hope for peace. What was the will of the people? Did they want aggression? Is this the Iraq they want? And when we hear US ranting about immigrants, please understand that when people's homes become uninhabitable, they will look for alternatives. So are Iraqis free now? Are the children happy? Is the world a safer place? No. The US has lost over 4,500 people and $3 trillion of US taxpayers' money. But the 0.1% is richer than ever before, vastly richer. The CHILCOT report, a British public inquiry released in 2016, stated that at the time of invasion of Iraq, Saddam Hussein did not pose an urgent threat to British interests, that intelligence regarding weapons of mass destruction was presented with unwarranted certainty, that peaceful alternatives to war had not been exhausted, that the United Kingdom and the United States had undermined the authority of the United Nations Security Council, that the process of identifying the legal basis was far from satisfactory, and that war was unnecessary. In a declassified mail from Tony Blair to George Bush, Tony Blair says, "I will be there for you, whatever." Such was the resolve to loot. The demonic playlist has been successful in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Venezuela, etc., etc. Did the playlist tracks ring a bell? Can you notice how the playlist narratives are always being used against India now that we have a government with a spine? Remember how our democratically chosen PM is always called a fascist dictator? How is PM Modi a fascist dictator when India is a democracy and he has faced elections over and over and won? Why was the puppet PM Manmohan Singh never called a dictator? Because he was compliant with the demands of 0.1%. He would bend over and give access to whatever was wanted. But with PM Modi, this free access is restricted. Hence, the playbook is out. We also hear the tracks of oppression of minorities. Where is the oppression of minorities? For a comparative reference, oppression is what is happening to Hindus in Pakistan, especially Hindu girls, to Baloch and Sindhis. The track of human rights are being violated also runs again and again in Kashmir, with Dalits, with women, with certain community. Who are the amplifiers? The same band of international media and politicians. Perhaps now we can understand how dangerous Amnesty International was for India. We have to be alert and not take anything published in newspapers or blared on TV channels as gospel of truth. We have to choose our source of news with care. As India becomes stronger and wealthier, these 0.01% greedy ones will become more determined to break into our country to usurp our resources. And the stronger is our pushback, the more desperate would be their resolve. Their methodology is to control the narrative. We have to learn to break the narrative by giving it zero traction. How vulnerable we are was showcased in 2020 Delhi riots. This is India's capital with the best security apparatus. It is really incumbent upon us and us alone to not let Delhi become Mosul and not let India become Iraq.